Okay. In this video, we will discuss about project, a real-time project using SpringBoot. Okay. Before we go to this real-time structure of this project, first let's discuss about that SpringBoot API calls, how it looks, and what are the best practices that we need to follow. And this is the interview question mostly asked on SpringBoot REST API calls or even REST architecture. If you are designing a API, right, and you are consuming the resources, right, to consume the resource, you just cannot write the API just like that, right? It should be meaningful. It should have follow some standards. Those are called as the best practices. Okay. Let's start first with the REST API. What is actually the REST API or REST API? Representational State Transfer Protocol. Means REST API, it is an architectural based style. We are implementing our APIs using this architectural style. What is called as REST API? REST is representational state transfer. Here, using this API, REST calls, we are consuming the APIs. To consume the APIs, what we need, we try to consume the API, or no, consuming in the sense either we can send the data, we can get the data, we can update the data, and so on. Means we are performing some CRUD operations, like how we are performing CRUD operations on the SQL database, right, or any database. The same way, using REST, we are writing the APIs. Those API calls behave differently according to our requirement. To do that, what is required? We need HTTP methods. All those HTTP methods are the actions that need to perform on our endpoints. Basically, this URL, uniform resource locator, it looks with this structure. Example, it is some server, okay, any server. Let's take it, if you deploy the application, it's a dev server. And it need follow some standard like API and the version, which version we are using. In real-time projects, when we are working with the projects, we have the versioning of the APIs. So that is the reason we have to maintain the version. Versioning, why we are maintaining a version is, now assume we have implemented any project with some set of requirements. It gone to production. Later again, we are rewriting the API or enhancing the API where, right, according to the new requirement, that API gets changed. And that is not required for that customer. And if you want to share that with the different customer or maybe say customer, so we have to have a versioning of that, right? Either you can consume the APIs with older version or new version. So according to the versioning, then you can have access to consume those APIs. That is the reason we have to maintain versioning. And next thing is model. What is this model? This is called as a base. For example, okay, let's say this, we call it as a base URL. What is this called? Base URL means this is common for all your endpoints at the controller level. Next, what is the next step? Next, we have to give a mapping. Before you access your endpoints, you have to different models are there in your project. For example, if you take a employees, right, to maintain employees data, right, creating employee, getting all the employees, get by ID, pay, or update, delete, and so on. So by model ways, we are creating a controller. There is one controller for every model. One controller for employee data, another controller for tax employee management, and another is HR portal, so on, so on. That let every controller is differentiated with some specific keyword, what is called as model wise. Then what we are doing, for example, let's take employees. Now this employees slash means using this employees, then we are going ahead with our API calls. Now, what are those HTTP methods? At first, post using C employees. This is the base and base URL endpoint request mapping. This is the request mapping, right? And again, you have a HTTP method is to post. Then how this URL forms here? Then if you copy this and put it down here, slash employees, then your final URL will be constructed like this base URL and the endpoint. For the post, you no need to have one more keyword, like say again for the post method, right? Here posting a data, again you do not say anything, slash again employees or create employee, right? Like that, as many people are saying create emp something so on like that. So that is not needed at all. Here posting the employees, say this is enough. That employees means you are posting employees, you are posting the data, so you can go ahead with that. Using the same endpoint mapping path, you can have one word what that employees get all employees means. Here this is a HTTP method used to get all the employees, and this is used to create employees. And another is after for under the employees, right? We are expecting to get the record by ID or delete by ID, update by ID. So how, what is the pattern that need to follow? Slash curly braces and employee ID. Under this ID, based on ID. Now how this URL will be formed now? Okay, this URL will be formed like this. This at this moment, say this will be like this employee ID. This employee ID is the path variable that you are sending from your user interface. Or if you are using any testing tool like Postman, you have to send like this. Employee ID is dynamic. Here you're sending 1, 2, 3, 4, so on, whatever that may be. Based on the ID, the record will be fetched from the backend API. Okay, now let's go with the method. That first thing is get. Again, using the same endpoint, right? You have a different method. Let's different put HTTP method and delete HTTP method and patch. So this is how you have to structure your API calls. As I said, best practices. What best practices is? Make sure you don't use verbs for your APIs. What's that verbs? In the sense that if you are posting an employee, then again you don't say that here like this, get employees like this. Okay, don't use any verbs here. This is called as a get employees in, or sorry, this is post, right? Okay, create employees, don't any verbs your endpoints. Okay, and similarly for get also you say, right, get employees like this. You don't use any verbs like this. Again, get by ID, get by, so all these things are not needed. The basic structure, the basic format, standard format is this one. Always use a plural for your mapping path. Okay, don't use any verbs like get to put to post. This already HTTP method is already doing that job. Again, why you have to write that? It is again redundant code. Again, it is not the right way and it's not a standard. If anyone look at this API, it should be clean and easy to understand that. That is the reason we have to follow the best practices. This is the first thing. Next thing is, once you are posting a data, instead of avoiding any exceptions, right, with the mandate values, right? For example, now when you are creating any employee record, there are certain fields which are not mandatory. Employee email ID is there, phone number is not mandatory, and his secondary address is not mandatory. So to hold this other fields as mandatory, like employee ID is mandatory, first name, last name, and his mobile number, and so on. If any mandatory fields are there, we have to implement validations. There are different approaches are there to implement validations. One is using validate framework. At the rate validate, you can apply those validation case messages on your bean, which bean you are posting the details from your postman tool or user interface. Okay. How you define the validation, that way it will trigger the messages to the end user. If any mandate field is missing, then the message will be shown to the end user saying this field is missing, instead of facing not any issues before persisting to the database. Because in the backend also we've seen that it is not mandatory. If any field that make it as a not null, then if that is coming null, then unwanted errors are coming. So like that, we have to validate your form data. Next thing is, when you are getting the data or set of records from the API, sometimes it may be more than 100 to 1000 in real-time scenarios of lakhs of records also there. We cannot get all the data from that right in one shot. Means application will get hang because it has to spool the entire database to get all the records. Application will get stuck. It never respond to your calls. To do that, we have to implement search fields. What criteria you are expecting? You are expecting to get employees, all active employees, or by department, by salary wise, or by first name, something like that, or by other field, anything. So you have to have a search criteria. Okay, at least to provide one input search criteria. So that also you have to mandate at the front end. If you are using any technology, Angular or what XTJS, whatever it may be, okay, you have to mandate that this field should be mandate to send the request to the API. Once you send the request, for that again you may have matching records more than 1000, 2000, some thousand. Again, that is also a huge load. So again, what you have to do, the next step is you have to implement a pagination. By default, most of expect 10 pages, 10 records per page. Like that, every time when you navigating, right, it has to hit the database to get only that many records. If you set the pagination size is 10 records, you could see 10 records per page. It is up to you. If you want to see the 50 records also, that is also not a huge load. 50 records you can get, but nobody will expect that to display 500 records in a page. So there is a limitation to expect in the pagination also. 50 records we can support, 100 records will support, but that is difficult for user to keep scroll down, right? So like that you have to implement a pagination. Next thing is handling exceptions also. Unfortunately, there might be issues while fetching the data from the backend when we are doing some processing, right? After we get the data, maybe we are doing something like first name, last name together, of combining and returning as a display as a username, or some mandate data is missed that we are trying to get and setting to some of our poses before it comes to the UI. So we'll have null pointer exceptions. So we have to have a clear view of this exception handling. That's a proper way of exception handling. In Spring Boot we have three different ways we can think that. Using custom exceptions we can map that, or using programmatic, using controller advice. Mostly preferred is controller advice, because this controller advice is the common place or central place where all the exceptions will be handled there. You still create your custom exceptions and map to that controller advice, where that is the central place, central location to look at all your exceptions and throw to the user. Like that, we have these best practices that need to follow. These are the minimum best practices before we start implementing our APIs. Now, let's see, this is the base URL and these are all the endpoints as we see. Now, if we have a little confusion, no worry, that we can make it clear during our hands-on example. Now let's start. Okay, the same API we'll discuss, have it in the application. Now we have a project created already. Now let's close this everything. Now, what is the first step? That we'll have the controller that need to create. Let's look at the project structure, how the folders create, right? If you create a SpringBoot project, you don't see all these folders. By default, you could see only this folder and the main application. Then your requirement is that you are sending the request. Right, from where you are sending the request, there is an initial point to send the request or to get the response. That is called as a controller. Okay, you just create one controller package and create your model specific file. If it is employee controller or address controller or department controller, so on, so on. Okay, let's create one controller class. Okay, that is simple. Before that, it will be a plain Java class. You don't have this one right now. At the moment you create a file, you don't have anything. When you say REST controller, right, the controller, then your class will behave as a controller. What is a controller? It is actually a servlet. It acts as a HTTP servlet. If you heard about that HTTP servlet programming, what it is doing, it takes the request and send the response back, and whatever the features available in the servlet version you are using, those features will be included in your class, means which supports all these features. So when you mark that controller as this class will behave as a servlet. Why do we need REST controller? We already have a just controller is there. There is no difference. Both controller and REST controller will still work for you, but there is slight difference. If you use REST controller, which means your class will work as a REST APIs, which means it send the response as a part of body. Then we have to go with the REST controller. Otherwise, if you don't have a requirement to send the responses body, right, and you are sending the response in different format and you are just delegating the calls, then simply you can go with the controller. Most of the time, 90% if they are using Spring Boot, right, just likely they are using REST controller only. Okay. And now, as we discussed the API and version, as this is the standard syntax that we do, because this is the application programming interface and this is the API that need to map the version 1. And as told you, right, we'll have this employees, right, first to post, right. See, this is the employees / employees to post the data. See, I don't have anything, right here. I have not written anything, get employees and all. And create employee here. Also, you have to give proper name also. Okay, and see the same path I have used for get, but this path and this path are same. Some people think that there might be it will not work as both the mappings are same, but this controller will look at your HTTP method name. What is the HTTP method? Even the path is same, but this guy is doing this one. Okay, now if you try to copy paste the same thing here, okay, and this time I give something name as a different as get address. But if you say get employees, right, what it do, then both the endpoints are same. Both the paths are same, methods are different. Even the methods are different, still it have conflict to which API endpoint method I have to call. This time you will get the exception. This time you have to have this. If, for example, you are calling addresses, employee / addresses, employee / address, then you will have this. Then there is no conflict with that. Like that, you have to give the mapping paths correctly. And next thing is employee / employee by ID. By ID, what we are performing by ID? Again, get mapping, we are getting the data by ID. In the under the employees by ID. Again, to update the data, again for employees I'm updating, and for delete also I'm passing the ID. Now up to here it is fine. How this data get from the backend? For that you have to follow some layers, different layers. One is from the controller, the request go to your service. From service, what is a service? It contained only that method prototype. Means service class is nothing but a just interface. It contains the list of method that you need to perform on the employee object. And then service implementation, where you have a logic if you are converting from the data, incoming data from that POJO to entity, means model to entity. Then all this logic has to be placed there. Again, if you have any logic that need to write that in the service implementation layer. Again, from that you call repository. And from there, if you have anything, right, and DAO, helper, utility, so on, all these things will come step by step. Now, let's see. Here, I have an employee service. Now, when I say get all employees, see, this is the employee service. I have all the methods to perform on this employee object. If I say implementation, see, this guy having all the implementation. To find there is a repository again. Say I am referring a employee repository is that. So like that we have all these multiple layers. Each of the layer is responsible for certain code. We cannot place everything in the controller class. That is not the right thing. Controller class you use to delegate your request, take the request and send the response. It should not have more lines of code. It have maximum of 4-5 lines. You cannot have lengthy code in the controller. It should look neat and clear. Now, entities, right? In real-time scenarios, you will have the entities, right? What is this entities? It is a ORM tool, right? It comes when you are using a ORM. What is this ORM? ORM stands for Object Relational Mapping. What do you mean by object relational mapping? Object, we are mapping to the relational database. What object? Our Java object. Our Java object, we are mapping to our relational database. That is called as ORM. It helps us to map your Java object directly to your database. By default, it will not just work like that. You cannot do on its work with just magic. We have to write some steps. You have to configure things to make it work. So let's start with what things are required to work with this ORM. At first, in the pom.xml, when you create a SpringBoot project, right, minimum dependency is SpringBoot start web. This web content, if the moment you add this web dependencies, it is loading a number of libraries. Okay, now let's see this how it works. Now go to new, start with the project, new project. Okay, there is a SpringBoot starter project. Then you just give any name of this. Okay, test app. Okay, go to next, and here you have to choose which version of SpringBoot you want. If you go SpringBoot 3.x onwards, make sure you should have that JDK 17 installed. From Spring 3 onwards, it expect minimum JDK is 17. If you don't have that JDK, please switch back to 2.x. And now we have all the dependencies supporting here. SpringBoot support number of dependencies. DevTools, what it is there, and Google Cloud Platform, you can work with that. And iOS teams, right? Spring Batch validation, Spring Java Mail Scheduler, Quartz Job, so on. And for messaging, right? Spring integration, WebSocket, Kafka, ActiveMQ, so many are there, and NoSQL, MongoDB, and everything, right? All these dependencies are there. So we can play a role in all these dependencies. Right? If you are using Spring Boot, means you will have the support, you will have all these features to apply in your project. Now, as discussed, just select Spring Web dependency. The moment to select the web dependency, it means it is a single dependency. As you could see here, these dependencies I have added in our test applications. Now let's close all these things. Okay, go back to this test application. Now see what it is happen. Now see this. There are no other dependencies. This is a test, means it is used for test cases, to write test cases. Now you could say this is a Springboot starter web. It's only one dependency added. But however, if we expand this one, you could see how many libraries, how many jar files it is downloaded for us, right, to do all stuff. This Springboot starter web, Springboot starter boot, auto configurer, start logging, logback. It is supporting all logback, log4j is there, SL4j, and the annotation, Springboot starter, data bind annotation score. You see Tomcat, embedded Tomcat, as we discussed in the previous video, right? A Springboot comes with a default embedded Tomcat. See, it comes with a Tomcat. Okay, Tomcat version is 9.0 version, and Springboot, Spring Bean support, right? AO, WebMVC, AOP, context, expression, so many things are there. You could see this one. For to write the test cases, JUnit Jupyter is there, and Market also it will add it here. It is a powerful framework which will help us to write our test cases like this. These many dependencies are keep getting added. This is the only disadvantage when we use Springboot. Even though you are not utilizing, you are not using all these jar files, but still it is just downloading for you and load in the repository. So when do we use Springboot is if we have microservice project, if we have this right entire application with more complex, then we go for Springboot. Unnecessarily, if we keep adding the dependencies like that, if you add one more dependency like this, then it can download instead of these many, at least say 5 to 10 minimum jar files. All those unnecessary. If you have number of projects in our organization and everyone need this support, right? Then you no need to re-download this. All these jar files will be downloaded in one central location, okay, in Maven repository, okay, where we are hosting the application there, so they will all consume there because the jar files, the library is already available in that location, so they can just reuse like that. Otherwise, all these downloaded jars are unused and unnecessary space, and this size will be increased. So that is the only disadvantage in the Springboot. But however, Springboot help us to develop our applications quite fast. Okay, now go step by step with this. Now once you create a project, right, you have all the jar file that is required, right, downloaded. Say Hibernate is downloaded. Why Hibernate has come here? In this pom.xml, we have that dependency added. Now look at this pom.xml. What I have added? I have added Springboot starter web and Springboot dev tools. What is this dev tools? Is that when you are writing a program and if you do small modifications, right, every time you no need to restart your application server. It auto reloads. It will instruct your Tomcat, hey, there is a change in the application. It can instruct the Spring container, instruct the Tomcat, means it send a event, it send a notification like a kind of events internally. The Springboot implement that whenever you have this jar downloaded in our class path, then it will trigger the command to the Tomcat. There is a change in the application, please restart it, automatically restart. So that's what this dependency is needed. And Springboot starter web is dependency, is the main dependency to support all our Springboot application to implement our web entire web applications. And there is a validation. Why this? We have, as discussed right now, right, we have a form validations, right? To validate our form data, we need to have this validator framework. That we will see in the next upcoming lecture, how we can validate the form data. Now, next thing is this JPA. What Springboot Starter JPA? It is the ORM support. It is starts with it comes with a inbuilt is a Hibernate implementation. This JPA is just only the specification. JPA stands for Java Persistence APA. When to persist your Java objects to the underlying database, which database you have configured. But Springboot by default comes with the Hibernate implementation. If you don't want the Hibernate implementation and if you want to go with the Eclipse, Ibetix or right, that no matter, you can go with your own implementation, but you have to exclude this explicitly in this dependency. How you do that exclude means we have a section called exclusions. If you look at this, see exclusions, and here what you want to exclude here, right? You say exclusion, and you have to here that exclude Hibernate. Then you can go ahead with your implementation, either Eclipse Link or Ibetix or some other, whatever your choice. Then Springboot will automatically exclude that. Whichever it is supporting default ORM implementation, it will not look at for you. Whichever the implementation you have loaded as a part of dependencies, then this JPA will automatically wire to that implementations, which means it will exclude your default ORM support by the Springboot. So now here, this one more dependencies, two more are there. It is ActiveMQ. I will show you this. What is ActiveMQ is that we'll have a separate session on this. What ActiveMQ and what is this required? Why is this required and where we are using this? And Springboot configuration processor. Why this is special annotation? In case in real-time scenario, we have multiple systems, means multiple environments are there. Environment to environment, the configuration is different. That to read the data, to read the configuration for the different environment, right, we will have a separate file which is outside of your application. You cannot have inside of the application. It's always sending this from the outside. In our application, we'll have just a placeholder. What is this? But the keys are same and the values are different. Make sure the keys should be maintained unique, same, and values will be different from environment to environment. For example, database URL, username, password, and if you have any mail server details, fax details, and any configuration parameters, so on, so on. Those keys are same, the values will be different. For dev schema, dev username, dev db, so on like that. For testing, it is different. For validation, pre-validation, UAT, production, every time as well. If you keep switching from one environment to another environment, then configuration keep different. So to support that, we have to read that property file. You have to use that property sources. Property sources is the annotation that will help you to read that source. What that source is a property file. So to support that annotations, we need this Springboot configuration processor annotation. Okay. Next, this is the dependency. I am using MySQL database. So Springboot does not know which one you are using. Whichever you configured as a dependency, it will load those jar files and in our class path and ready for our support. Like we see in previous video, if you are working with Oracle JDBC, you have to load that driver. If you are working with MySQL, you have to load that MySQL driver. To load all this stuff, right, you have to have this dependency. Then Springboot automatically load these jars and available in our class path to move ahead. So I have all these dependencies are in our project. Okay, we'll discuss step by step about these things. Now let's go with the employee CRUD operations. Now, as we see in this, right, we have an employee controller already return this. Okay, go to that controller file and see. Now this employee controller. What I'm doing this is the first layer is the controller layer, and the next layer is the service layer. And when you are calling your service method, you have to auto-write those auto-write your service layer. And when you say service layer, right, this guy also is the interface, but this has to be available. The moment if you auto-write, this implementation class or this one should be auto-environment or treated by employee. Then if you look at this one, service MPL, right, it is marked as service annotation. In general, as a best practice here, again, I can say here in the controller layer, we use employee service here, right? Just give this employee service, which means then Spring treat this as a Spring component, and when you are auto wiring, it has to load as a part of Spring container. Otherwise, when you are trying to auto wire this something that I could not find, you are saying employee service, but employee service, where can I fetch employee service? Okay, this is a part of this child, means same service implemented service. Now, if you look at this, if you don't auto wire, if you remove this auto wire section, for example, service annotation like this. Now, what happens? Now run this project. See, it will not run. See, it is error. Why this error? Field employee service in package required a bean type employee service that cannot be found. See, employee service is there here when it is trying to spool all the components scanning internally, it looking at this employee service. We have told that this has to be auto void. Okay, meant auto void has to find out this guy has to be a component of part of a Spring container. Otherwise, how do I do that? Because you are giving instruction to lower this as a part of Spring container to auto void that inject this dependency, but I could not find the dependency to inject it. When the Spring container find the dependency classes, that also is a part of Spring container, means it's as part of Spring objects. How they become a Spring beans? Any class that should be marked with at least one annotation, either a component or service or repository or a bean, then only Spring knows that this is a Spring bean that need to be loaded in the Spring container and make it available for further uses. So this way you have to please mark all these classes with annotations which we are trying to auto wire that. Otherwise you could see this one, you cannot find Spring container, cannot find those things. Okay, make sure all this injecting this dependency should be taken care properly. Okay, now we will stop here. In the next class we will discuss about more all this complete project life cycle. Okay.